We are issuing an official warning that you are in violation of HOA rules. I froze, staring at the police officers standing on my porch like they had just handed me a death sentence. Are you sure you're at the right house? I asked, barely believing what I was hearing. My property isn't even part of any HOA. It never was. There's no way this could be real. I'll tell you how I got here. It's funny looking back how calm and normal everything felt. You know, when you're young, you always dream about what your life's going to look like once you make it. For me, it was always a house, my own place, nothing fancy, just a solid roof, a little space to breathe, maybe a yard for the dog. I didn't need anything extravagant, just something that felt like home. After years of renting, I finally had the chance to buy. It was a big deal. I found this little place tucked away on the edge of town. It wasn't some gated community or anything with fancy rules, just a neighborhood, you know? I remember thinking how perfect it was. It was quiet, a little old, but charming. A 3-bedroom, decent backyard, room for a garden, a perfect place to get my life going. I didn't care much about all that HOA stuff. Honestly, I never even thought about it. Who really does? It was always some far-off idea, like some distant force that has nothing to do with you. So I sign the papers, move in, and immediately start making it mine. Paint the walls, plant some roses, get the grill out back. Living the dream. Life was simple, peaceful, just the way I liked it. There were a few neighbors who were friendly enough, but no one was breathing down my neck. I didn't have to follow any rules, aside from the basic stuff like paying taxes and keeping the place from falling apart. I was good with that. One thing I've always taken pride in is keeping my place looking decent. No over-the-top decorations or crazy lawn art, just a clean, neat house that blended in. I figured I'd keep to myself, be a good neighbor, and live out my days quietly. I wasn't one to get involved in any community nonsense. You know, HOA meetings and all that? I couldn't even tell you what the rules of any HOA in town were. I didn't need to. Why would I? Then, a couple of months ago, I get this letter, the kind you get when something is serious. I opened it, and right away I could tell it wasn't the usual welcome to the neighborhood type of letter. Nope. This one was a demand, from an HOA I didn't even know existed, telling me that my property was now part of their jurisdiction. They didn't even have the decency to call it a mistake. The letter said I had to abide by their rules. They'd even thrown in some legal jargon, the kind that makes your stomach turn, even if you don't understand half of it. Violations of property standards. They made it sound like I was running a junkyard in the backyard. The audacity. I'm reading this thing, trying to figure out what the hell it was even about. I knew right away, there was no way this could be happening to me. My property wasn't even near any of the HOA-controlled areas. I did some digging, checked the maps, looked at my deed, all that. I wasn't wrong. There was no way in hell I was a part of their little club. But the letter made it seem like I had just missed some invisible line that nobody told me about. At first, I thought it was just a mistake, so I ignored it. Figured someone would catch it and fix it. But the letters kept coming. And then the phone calls. I remember the first time I picked up the phone thinking it was just a friendly reminder, maybe even a mistake they wanted to clear up. Instead, I got a woman on the other end, Karen, I found out later, the president of this HOA, telling me that I had violated their rules by having too many trees. Too many trees. I was like, wait, what do you mean too many trees? I planted a couple of oak trees in the backyard. They're just trees. But no, apparently according to her, it was a violation of HOA rules because those trees weren't approved by them. And that was just the start. More complaints came in about minor stuff like where I parked my car, even though I had the space to park. She told me I couldn't store firewood on my property anymore because it was unsightly. Firewood. Unsightly. It was all too much. I finally gave in and called her, figuring I could at least hear her out and maybe get this whole mess figured out. But the way she spoke to me, like she had the power to dictate my life. She said, "Mr. Lawrence, you must follow the rules of the association. It's a community, you understand?" The way she said it, like I was some kid who didn't get it, made my blood boil. I told her, flat out, that I wasn't part of any HOA, I didn't sign anything, and I wasn't going to start bending over backwards just because she said so. But she wasn't hearing it. "We'll be in touch," she said, and then hung up. That was the moment I realized I was in trouble. I didn't know what the hell HOA even had the power to do, but I was damn sure about to find out. And that's when things started to spiral. I started getting more letters, more notices. They were relentless, sending me threats of fines and warnings, all because of what felt like some personal vendetta. And you know the worst part? The whole thing just felt like a setup. Like someone was waiting for me to slip up so they could pounce. I started asking around, talking to neighbors. A few were sympathetic, but most just seemed to want to stay out of it. That's when I realized this was a machine, a system, and I was just another cog. But no way was I going down without a fight. I wasn't about to let this woman, this Karen, push me around. I've got rights, I thought. I'll stand up for myself. But I had no idea what was coming next. The first time I really felt the heat from HOA was when I woke up to an email from Karen. That was the president of the HOA, if you hadn't guessed, saying they were conducting a routine inspection of my property. Routine. I don't know what's routine about showing up uninvited, but sure enough, there it was. I hadn't even noticed anything was off, so when I saw the email, I just shrugged it off. I figured they'd just do a quick walkthrough and maybe take a note or two, but nothing serious, right? I was wrong. The next morning, a car pulls up outside, and I'm standing in my kitchen making coffee when I spot Karen walking across my lawn, clipboard in hand like she owns the place. I'm not exaggerating. She practically strutted across my yard like she was surveying land she just conquered. I don't know what made me angrier, her attitude or the fact that she was poking around on my property, uninvited, with no warning. I should have gone outside and told her to get off my lawn right there, but I didn't. I guess I thought maybe this wasn't the hill to die on. Big mistake. I watched her make a note, checking things off that clipboard like she was reading my entire life. First, she walked by my garden, which looked fine, by the way. It's not like I'm growing weed out there, just a couple of tomato plants and some flowers, but she had this weird look on her face like she was disappointed. Next, she checked my front door, stared at my mailbox, and then, the real kicker, she looked at the trees. Yeah, the trees. Remember those oak trees I mentioned? Apparently, they were too large and too close to the house, according to her. She jotted something down, and I could already feel my blood start to boil. She turned around, practically beaming. "Mr. Lawrence," she said, like she was some sort of expert on all things homeownership. "There are several issues here that need to be addressed. We'll be sending you a formal notice soon." I asked her straight up what the issue was, and she looked at me like I was the one being unreasonable. "You can't just do whatever you want on your property," she said. "There are guidelines we all follow to maintain the community standards." I told her again, my voice a little firmer this time, "This is my property, my house. I didn't sign anything to join some HOA. This isn't your jurisdiction." She didn't even blink. "It doesn't matter," she said. "The expansion plan for the HOA has been updated. Your property is now included." I'm pretty sure I went pale at that moment. I mean, how is that even legal? She was basically telling me my house was now part of some HOA that I never agreed to. I wasn't just irritated anymore. I was furious, but I kept my cool. I wasn't about to start yelling at some lady who thought she had the power to control everything in sight. I told her I'd be looking into it, and I shut the door in her face before she could say anything else. But of course it didn't end there. That was just the beginning. A couple of days later, I got a letter from the HOA. This wasn't some friendly, "we're just letting you know" kind of letter. No, this one was official. It was a list of demands. First, I had to trim the trees. They wanted them cut back to a certain height, saying they were a potential hazard. Then I had to paint the front door a certain color. Apparently, I was in violation of the approved color scheme for the neighborhood. Oh, and don't even get me started on the landscaping requirements. Apparently, my flowers were out of line. I felt like I was trapped in some twisted game I never agreed to play. How could they just throw a bunch of arbitrary rules at me and expect me to follow them? Was this really happening? I tried calling Karen, but she never answered. Instead, I got an email back telling me to take care of the issues listed in the letter within the next week or face penalties. I read it 3 times just to make sure I wasn't missing something. But nope, that's exactly what it said. And the penalties? Fines. Big ones. The kind of fines that would hurt my wallet. That's when I realized something serious was going on. This wasn't some small misunderstanding anymore. They were coming after me, and they weren't going to stop unless I did something about it. But the worst part? This whole thing wasn't even about the trees or the door color or the damn flowers. It was about control. Karen and her HOA were just using these ridiculous rules to exert power, and I was the unfortunate guy who had become their target. I knew I couldn't just roll over and accept it. I wasn't going to let this woman tell me how to live on my own property. But honestly, I had no idea where this was going to go or how much bigger this was about to get. It was a fight I didn't ask for, but it was one I was going to have to take on. So I thought things might die down after I ignored the first letter, but I couldn't have been more wrong. It was like poking a hornet's nest with a stick. Not even a week later, I get another letter. This time, it was more serious. They weren't just talking about trees or the color of my front door anymore. They had decided my whole property was a problem. I'll never forget the first time I read it. I was sitting on my couch trying to take a break from work when the mailman dropped off a thick envelope. I opened it up, and there it was, another one of those official-looking letters from HOA stamped with final notice. The tone was colder this time, like they'd already decided I was the villain in their little story. Apparently, they had inspected my property again. Only this time, they'd enlisted a team of specialists to look over every inch of my land. I felt like I was being treated like a criminal, not a homeowner. The letter demanded that I make serious changes, and I mean serious, not just trim the trees or paint the door. They said I had to tear down the small shed I'd built in the backyard. It wasn't even a big shed, just a place to store my lawnmower and a few tools. It didn't stick out or anything, but to them, it was an eyesore that violated their precious aesthetic guidelines. And the kicker? They also demanded I pay a fine of $500 for not complying with their previous order. Like what? $500 because I didn't paint my door the right shade of blue? Or because I had a couple of trees? And let's be real, it wasn't like my shed was blocking anyone's view or causing any problems. But that didn't matter to them. They had their checklist of rules, and damn it, I was going to follow them, whether I liked it or not. I'll admit, I was starting to feel a little bit desperate. I mean, at this point, they were practically calling my home a criminal enterprise. I'm not kidding. Every little thing on my property was being scrutinized. My fence wasn't tall enough. My mailbox wasn't the right style. I started to wonder if they were going to come after me for how many blades of grass I had in the yard. It felt ridiculous, and I didn't want to get into a long, drawn-out fight with HOA. I had work to do, and I didn't want to spend my days dealing with paperwork and these petty battles. But I wasn't about to just let them walk all over me either. So I did what anyone would do when they feel backed into a corner. I fought back. I called Karen and tried to reason with her, but that was like talking to a brick wall. She didn't want to hear anything I had to say. She just kept repeating the same line. These are the rules and you need to follow them. If you don't, we'll take legal action. At first, I thought maybe I could hire a lawyer, but it was clear they had all the legal groundwork covered. They knew what they were doing. They had lawyers on their side who made sure every letter they sent was worded perfectly so that if I decided to challenge them, they could drag me through a maze of legal loopholes. It wasn't just about the trees or the shed anymore. It was about me fighting a faceless system that had all the power, and all I had was a damn lawnmower. A couple of weeks later, I get another visit. This time, it's not Karen, but a couple of guys in suits standing at my door with a clipboard. I open it thinking it's just some random salespeople, but no. These guys were official HOA inspectors. They didn't even say hello. One of them barely looked at me before he started walking around my property, jotting down notes, like I wasn't even there. I don't know if you've ever had someone walk onto your property, completely ignoring you, and start inspecting your life like you're some criminal. It's unsettling. It makes you feel small. I tried to ask what they were doing, but one of them just waved me off. He barely said anything other than, "We're just doing our job." What job? I had no idea. All I knew was they were walking around my house like it didn't belong to me. I tried to talk to them, but they were all business. And right when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the guy with the clipboard turned to me and said, "You're going to have to get rid of the shed. It's in violation of the association's structural integrity guidelines." I was dumbfounded. Structural integrity? It was a tiny shed. I wasn't running a construction company out of it. "You have 10 days to comply," he added before walking off without another word. I stood there, just staring after them. It felt like they had won, like the walls were closing in. Now I knew this was more than just some neighborhood dispute. This was a personal attack. They weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted, and I was in their sights. It was clear as day. If I didn't fight back now, they'd keep pushing until they had me on my knees, begging for mercy. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. I wasn't going to let them take my home, not like this. If I had to go head-to-head with every single one of them, I would. But the weight of it all, the constant pressure, the mounting fines, the threats hanging over my head, was starting to get to me. It was like they had me in a vice, slowly tightening until I couldn't breathe. I knew the fight was far from over. And the worst part? It was just beginning. I decided I needed to try and handle this the right way. You know, the grown-up way. I wasn't about to let this HOA run me out of my own house without at least trying to smooth things over. So I started looking for a solution, a way to get these people off my back without burning every bridge in the neighborhood. I thought maybe if I just made a couple of concessions, they'd lay off. Maybe paint the door the right shade of blue, trim the damn trees to meet their aesthetic standards. I don't know what I was thinking, honestly, but at that moment, I figured I had nothing to lose. So I shot Karen an email asking for a meeting. a sit-down. I wanted to explain where I was coming from, and maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to resolve this without getting lawyers involved. I didn't get an answer for a couple of days, so I tried calling her. Again, no luck. But I didn't give up. I kept at it, thinking, this has to be fixable. After all, I was just some guy living in a house, not some major criminal. What could they possibly want with me? So I finally left a voicemail saying, Karen, I think we can work this out. I'm happy to meet with you. Just let me know when you're free. A couple of days later, I got a call back. It was Karen, and as you'd expect, she wasn't exactly thrilled. But I tried to stay calm. I wasn't going to let her escalate this. She said, I don't know why you're making such a big deal out of this. These are the rules, Mr. Lawrence. If you'd just follow them, we wouldn't have any issues. Her voice was so cold, like she was talking to someone who had no right to question her authority. But I kept my cool. I said, look, I'm not trying to make a big deal. I just want to understand what's going on. I want to resolve this without anyone getting hurt. There was a long pause on the other end. Then she said, fine. We can meet, but understand this. The rules are the rules. I can't make exceptions. I set up a meeting for the next day. It felt like the first real chance I had to stand up for myself without it turning into a full-on war. I had to make it count. I decided to go in calm, collected, and with an open mind. Maybe we could talk things through like reasonable adults. Maybe she wasn't the total nightmare I was imagining. I showed up at the HOA office, a little bland building with white walls, barely any character, just a box with a few filing cabinets and a receptionist who didn't even look up from her desk when I walked in. Karen came out shortly after. She looked exactly like I imagined, stern, no nonsense, and like she was in charge of the whole universe. We sat down in one of the meeting rooms, and the first thing she did was slide a thick binder across the table at me. She didn't say anything, just shoved it towards me. I opened it, and it was filled with page after page of HOA guidelines, regulations, rules for everything from mailbox designs to tree height limits. She didn't even look at me while I was scanning through it. She just stared at the wall, arms folded. I started flipping through the pages, trying to understand what the hell they were trying to do to me. I mean, I had followed the basic rules, right? Keep your lawn trimmed, keep things clean, don't start any loud parties. But this was different. I had never agreed to any of this. Finally, I looked up and said, Karen, I get it. These are your rules, and I understand you have a job to do. But I'm telling you, I never agreed to be part of this HOA. I didn't sign up for this. Her face didn't change, but she leaned forward and said, Mr. Lawrence, you're part of this community now. You bought a property that's in our jurisdiction. It's not about what you signed or didn't sign. It's about the community you chose to live in. We all have to follow the same standards. She said that last part like she was reciting some sort of mantra, like it was gospel, and I'm sitting there trying to wrap my head around the fact that this woman, who I didn't even know existed until a few weeks ago, was telling me that my house wasn't really mine anymore. It was part of some imaginary line she drew on a map. At that point, I had to admit it. There was no talking to her. She was locked in, and every word out of her mouth was just another brick in the wall. But I wasn't giving up. I still tried to explain that all I wanted was to find a solution, but the more I talked, the less she seemed interested. Her only answer was always, the rules are the rules. So I switched tactics. I asked if there was any way to compromise. I offered to trim the trees, paint the door, whatever I could do to make her back off. But Karen wasn't having it. You're not hearing me, Mr. Lawrence. This is about conformity. It's not about you. It's about the neighborhood, she said, like she was the one who had written the rules of the universe. I could feel my blood pressure rising, but I kept my voice steady. I don't want to fight. I just want to be left alone to live in my house. Can you work with me here? She stared at me for a while like she was deciding if I was worth her time. Finally, she said, I'll tell you what. You have 2 weeks to get the shed down and bring your property up to standards. If you don't, we'll have no choice but to take legal action. I couldn't believe it. I was trying to work with her, and this was the best she could do? 2 weeks? I walked out of that meeting more frustrated than when I walked in, but I wasn't ready to back down yet. I kept telling myself I could still fix this, that maybe I was just being too dramatic. Maybe if I complied, this nightmare would end. But deep down, I knew I wasn't going to be able to stop fighting. Not after everything that had happened. I had to make a stand, no matter what. The next few days were a blur of trying to figure out what to do. Could I fight this in court? Maybe, but I had no idea what I was up against, and I wasn't sure I wanted to drag it out that long. So I kept looking for ways to solve this peacefully, but it felt more and more like peace wasn't something I was going to find without a fight. I don't know what I was expecting at that point. After the meeting with Karen, I was at a total crossroads. I had tried everything I could think of to resolve this calmly, and it just wasn't working. 2 weeks. That's all I had left before they'd start hitting me with legal action. The pressure was mounting, and honestly, I felt like I was stuck in a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. So I did what anyone would do when they're backed into a corner. I started looking for loopholes. I knew I couldn't back down now. I had to fight, but I wasn't about to do it blindly. I started digging through the internet, looking into property laws, zoning regulations, and anything I could find about HOA jurisdiction. I even started talking to people I knew who had dealt with HOA issues before. Most of them just sighed and told me it wasn't worth the fight. They'd all lost. HOA had too much power, but I wasn't ready to hear that yet. I still believed I could win. And that's when I got a call from an old friend, Mike. Mike and I had known each other for years. We'd met in college, and even though we had both gone our separate ways professionally, we stayed in touch. He had always been one of the smartest guys I knew, and now he worked as a property lawyer. I never thought I'd be calling him for advice on something like this, but here we were. I explained everything to him: the trees, the shed, the fines, the constant threats from Karen and her HOA cronies. I told him I was running out of options. At first, he listened quietly, but when I finished, he told me to hold tight and not to do anything rash. I wasn't sure what he meant, but I agreed. He told me he'd look into it. That night, I was sitting at my desk, going through some of the documentation I'd gathered when my phone buzzed. It was Mike. He said he had something for me. He didn't give me much detail, just told me to meet him the next day. When I got to his office, he had a grin on his face that was way too wide for someone who was supposed to be helping me. "I've got some information that's going to change everything," he said, pulling a stack of papers out of his drawer. I sat down across from him, still feeling a little skeptical, but my curiosity was piqued. He pushed the papers across the desk and slid them over to me. I started looking through them, and it didn't take long before I saw what Mike was talking about. Turns out, Mike had done some digging into the HOA's records. He had gone over zoning laws and property deeds, searching for anything that could help me out. And then, buried deep in one of their official documents, he found it. A huge loophole that they had completely overlooked. Here's the thing. The HOA, at some point in the past, had expanded their jurisdiction to include certain areas, but not mine. My property had never been part of the HOA's boundaries, and the documents they had been sending me, they were all based on outdated, inaccurate maps. Mike found official records from the county that clearly showed my property had always been outside of the HOA's purview. That meant every demand they made, from the shed to the fines, was completely illegal. I couldn't believe it. I kept reading the papers, trying to make sense of it all. It was right there in black and white. The HOA had been using fraudulent documents to bully me. They'd been claiming authority over a property they had no legal right to govern. My property wasn't part of the HOA, and it had never been. Mike looked at me, still grinning. "You've got them, man," he said. "They've been using these fake maps to pressure you into complying with their rules. They've been bluffing the whole time." I was in shock. It was like the rug had been pulled out from under me. For the last few weeks, I'd been playing their game, thinking I had no way out. And here I was, sitting with concrete proof that they were lying to me the entire time. They had no legal ground to stand on. Mike then went a step further. He suggested I could hit them with a lawsuit of my own. It wasn't just about defending my property anymore, it was about holding them accountable for the mess they'd created. If I chose to fight, I could not only stop them from taking anything from me, but also force them to face legal consequences for their misconduct. I sat there for a long minute, just staring at the papers in my hands. Part of me wanted to rush straight to the courthouse and throw this in their faces. Another part of me, though, was terrified. This was a full-on war, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. But there was no turning back now. This wasn't just about the trees, the shed, or the stupid fines. It was about the principle of it all. I wasn't going to let some small-town HOA bully me out of my home. The next morning, I woke up with a new sense of purpose. I called Karen, not with the hope that we could work things out, but to let her know that the game had changed. I told her I had proof that my property wasn't part of their HOA and that I'd be taking legal action if they didn't back off. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, but when she finally spoke, I could hear the panic in her voice. She stammered, That's not possible. We have all the documentation we need." I didn't let her finish. "Your documentation is fake. You've been lying to me, and if you don't fix this, I'll make sure the whole neighborhood knows." The conversation didn't go much further after that. She hung up on me, and I was left standing there, holding the phone, realizing I had just turned the tables. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and emails. I had Mike on my side, and now it was time to take the gloves off. I wasn't backing down. The twist, the thing that changed everything, it wasn't just about beating them anymore. It was about making sure no one else ever had to go through this kind of nightmare. I knew now I had the upper hand, and I was ready to use it. Karen and her HOA had messed with the wrong guy, and now it was time to make them pay for it. So now that I had this bombshell, proof that the HOA had been bullshitting me from the start, I knew I couldn't just sit on it. It was go time. I was fired up, sure, but I also knew I had to be smart. This wasn't going to be some quick back and forth with Karen. This was a battle, and I needed a plan. A real, well-thought-out strategy if I was going to go up against something this big. I called Mike first thing after that phone call with Karen. He was the only person I trusted in this whole mess, and I needed his advice on how to handle this. I told him everything that had happened, Karen's reaction, her hang-up, and how I was ready to bring the fight to them. But I needed to figure out my next step. Mike listened, like always, and then dropped a bombshell of his own. He told me that given the documents I had, I could actually file a counterclaim against the HOA for using fraudulent maps and violating my property rights. I wasn't just going to defend myself anymore, I could hit them where it hurt. If I played this right, I could not only stop them from harassing me, but I could potentially get them to pay for all the legal fees and damages they had caused. That sounded great, but Mike made it clear it wasn't going to be easy. If I wanted to bring the fight to them, I had to be prepared for a long, drawn-out legal battle. HOA's got resources, they've got lawyers on their side, and they don't back down easily. But I was ready, I had proof, and that was my ace in the hole. The first step of my plan was simple: gather everything I could. I didn't want to just walk into court with a couple of documents and hope for the best. No, I needed an arsenal. So I spent days going over all the records I could get my hands on. Every email, every letter from Karen and the HOA, all the maps and zoning documents. I made sure I had everything, not just proof that my property wasn't part of the HOA, but also evidence of their shady tactics. I was going to nail them with their own lies. The second part of the plan was getting the neighbors on my side. This was one of those things where it wasn't just about me anymore. If I could show that Karen wasn't just messing with me, but with other people too, it would be harder for her to keep pushing. I had to get people to see that the HOA was overstepping its bounds, not just making a small mistake. So I started talking to the people I knew. A few were skeptical, sure, but some of them, the ones who dealt with Karen and her HOA over the years, started telling me their stories. It was like I'd cracked open a floodgate of frustration. One guy, Rick, told me how the HOA had tried to fine him for having a trampoline in his backyard. The thing was, he didn't even use the trampoline. It had been there for years, unused, just taking up space. But that didn't matter to Karen. She fined him. No warning, no discussion, just a fine for something that didn't even matter. That got me thinking. Maybe I wasn't the only one who was getting screwed over by this HOA. I started talking to more neighbors, getting them to write down their experiences with Karen and the HOA, even if it was something small. I wasn't sure if it would help, but if I had a bunch of people backing me up, Karen couldn't just sweep this under the rug. The more people I had involved, the harder it would be for her to ignore us. Next, I called a lawyer. This wasn't something I could do on my own. I needed someone with the expertise to make sure I didn't screw this up. Mike had given me a list of lawyers who specialized in property law, and I picked one who had experience dealing with HOAs. His name was Steve, and when I met with him, I could tell right away he knew what he was doing. He was sharp, no nonsense, and immediately jumped on board when I showed him the documents Mike had found. Steve went through everything I had, and then he said something that really clicked for me. You've got a solid case here, but it's about more than just defending your property. This is about sending a message. That's when I realized that this wasn't just about getting my shed back. It wasn't just about the trees or the mailbox or whatever ridiculous thing Karen was going to try next. This was about standing up to a corrupt system. This was about showing people that they didn't have to be afraid of HOAs anymore. If I could win this fight, it would give everyone else who'd been pushed around by these types of organizations the courage to speak up. So with Steve on my side, I started putting the final pieces together. We were going to file a counterclaim, and we were going to do it with everything I had. The HOA wasn't just going to be embarrassed by this, they were going to feel the heat. If I had to drag them through the mud, so be it. The next few days were a blur. There were meetings with Steve, calls with Mike, and constant back and forth with the neighbors. But everything was starting to come together. Every time I thought I was getting close to the end, I found something else. Some little piece of evidence that tied the HOA's lies together. I knew that once this got out, Karen would have a lot more to deal with than a couple of fines. I'll be honest, I was nervous. I mean, this was big. I was about to go up against a powerful organization with more money and resources than I could even imagine. But every time I thought about backing down, I remembered that phone call from Karen, how she hung up on me like I didn't matter. And I remembered all those neighbors who had dealt with the same thing and never said a word. It wasn't just my house anymore, it was bigger than that. This was about everyone who had ever been bullied by an HOA that thought it could get away with anything. I wasn't just going to fight for my property, I was fighting for all of us. And if I had to bring them to their knees to make sure it didn't happen again, then that's exactly what I was going to do. The plan was set. I wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. I'll be honest with you, when I started this whole mess, I wasn't sure what I was doing. I mean, I had the evidence, I had the motivation, but it felt like I was just throwing punches in the dark. But now I had a plan. And not just any plan, a good one. The counterattack had begun, and I wasn't holding back. The first thing I did was file the counterclaim. I was done playing nice. Karen and her HOA had pushed me into a corner, and now I was coming out swinging. I knew this was just the beginning of a long fight, but with Mike's help, the documents, the evidence, I felt like I had a real shot at turning the tables. I was no longer the guy trying to make peace. I was the guy fighting back, and that felt damn good. I remember the day I filed the claim. I was standing outside the courthouse, papers in hand, my heart racing like I was about to step into the ring for a big match. I handed everything over, signed my name, and left the building feeling like I'd just taken a huge weight off my shoulders. No turning back now. I couldn't wait to see the look on Karen's face when she realized I wasn't just going to roll over. The next step was getting the neighbors involved. I knew if I was going to make this work, I couldn't do it alone. So I started reaching out to everyone who had shared their stories with me, anyone who had dealt with the HOA in the past. I knew that if I could get them on my side, I could turn this from a personal fight into a community-wide movement. And that's exactly what I did. I started calling people up, setting up meetings, getting them to write statements about their experiences. Rick, who had been fined for the trampoline, was first on the list. He was pissed, and rightfully so. I asked him to come down to the lawyer's office and sign a statement, and he didn't hesitate. Soon after, more neighbors started reaching out. People I hadn't spoken to in months started getting involved. It was like the more I pushed, the more people I found who were willing to back me up. Everyone had a story about Karen or the HOA trying to screw them over, and I was the one leading the charge. I'll never forget the day I got the call from Mike after we'd filed the claim. He said, "We've got their attention now." Karen's reaction was exactly what I expected. She wasn't just pissed, she was scared. She wasn't used to people fighting back, especially not people with the kind of dirt I had on her. Mike said she'd probably start looking for a way out, maybe even offer a settlement, but I wasn't about to let her off that easy. And then, the real fun began. It was like watching a show unfold, only I was the one pulling the strings. I started receiving calls and emails from HOA members. They were trying to figure out what I was going to do next, how I was going to play this. But they were all playing catch-up. I was 3 steps ahead. Every time they tried to intimidate me with more threats, I came back with stronger evidence. The more they pushed, the more I pushed back. I wasn't going to give them an inch. But Karen? She was stubborn. You could see it in her eyes, in the way she handled herself in those meetings with the HOA board. She wasn't used to losing control, and she didn't know how to handle it when things started slipping from her grasp. Her calm, collected demeanor in the beginning was now replaced with desperation. The more I fought back, the more she began to unravel. And that was the moment I knew we had them. Things were heating up. I could feel the pressure building. Karen started reaching out to my lawyer, trying to negotiate a deal. She kept talking about how it was better for everyone to settle than to go through a long, expensive court case. But Mike wasn't having any of it. We weren't negotiating with someone who'd been making our lives miserable for months. We were going to finish this once and for all. One evening, after a particularly tense phone call from Karen, I realized I needed to do something bold. It wasn't enough to just keep fighting quietly behind closed doors. I needed to go public. I needed the community to know exactly what was happening. So I called the local newspaper. I'll never forget that conversation. I'd never been the kind of guy to put my personal business out there like that. But something about the way this whole thing had gone down made me think it was time for everyone to know what Karen and the HOA had been up to. I explained everything to the reporter, told them about the shady documents, the lies, the pressure tactics. He was all in, and within a couple of days, the story was live. It was a game changer. The local news picked it up, and suddenly Karen's nice little HOA empire was getting exposed. The pressure from the community was so intense that even people who didn't know me were starting to send me messages of support. People who'd been living under the thumb of HOA for years started speaking out. It was like the floodgates opened. Karen tried to spin the whole thing as an unfortunate misunderstanding, but it was too late. The truth was out. People weren't buying her excuses anymore. They knew what she was really about. And the best part, the HOA started crumbling. I wasn't the only one fighting back anymore. The neighborhood started coming together, and slowly but surely, people were calling for changes in the HOA leadership. Rick, the guy with the trampoline, was one of the first to start a petition to restructure the HOA's board. Others followed. The pressure was mounting, and Karen's grip on the HOA started slipping away. By the time we hit the court date, it wasn't just me standing there anymore. It was the entire community. People were watching, neighbors were speaking out, and the lawyers from HOA were looking nervous. I could see it in their eyes. They knew they were losing. And Karen? She was sweating bullets. In that moment, I realized something. I had done it. The counterattack wasn't just about protecting my property, it was about exposing the truth, making sure people knew what was really going on behind closed doors. And when the judge ruled in my favor, I knew we'd won. Not just for me, but for everyone who'd been bullied by the HOA for years. Karen and her HOA were on the ropes, and there was no way they were coming back from this. We had taken back control. The day the story went public felt like a wave crashing over me. Up until that point, it had been a battle fought behind closed doors. But once the newspaper picked up the story, everything changed. Suddenly, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the entire neighborhood, and I could feel the shift. It wasn't just my fight. It was everybody's. The article hit the local news, and I could already feel the tension in the air. It wasn't just in the streets. It was everywhere. People started talking. Neighbors who had kept quiet for years were suddenly speaking up. The local community had finally been exposed to the ugly truth. Karen and the HOA had been using lies, manipulation, and even fraud to bully homeowners into submission. I wasn't the only one who had been suffering in silence. The whole community had been, but no one had the guts to do anything about it, until now. The next morning, I walked out of my house and saw more than one neighbor standing by their driveway, reading the article on their phones, shaking their heads. It was like the floodgates had opened. People who I'd never even spoken to before were coming up to me, shaking my hand, offering their support. It was overwhelming in the best way possible. I was finally getting through to them. People were starting to realize the scope of the problem. Some of the neighbors I'd spoken to had dealt with Karen's tactics for years, but were too afraid to speak out. They were scared of retaliation, scared of the fines, the threats. But after reading the article, they saw it wasn't just my fight, it was our fight. And suddenly it felt like a movement was starting. Rick, the guy with the trampoline, was the first to step up publicly. He started gathering signatures for a petition to overhaul the HOA board, demanding Karen's resignation. He wasn't the only one. Another neighbor, Janet, who had always been quiet and kept to herself, stepped forward. She told her story about how Karen had tried to fine her for having a flower bed that wasn't up to standards. It was ridiculous, everyone knew it. And now, thanks to the article, people felt like they had a voice. Soon after, more and more people were coming forward. Some had been dealing with fines over trivial things like the size of their mailbox or where they parked their cars. Others had been subtly threatened for years, just waiting for someone to take a stand. But it wasn't until the article came out that they realized they weren't alone. It wasn't just one person fighting back, it was the whole community, and that made all the difference. The exposure didn't stop there. The story spread beyond the local news. It was picked up by some regional outlets and even got attention on social media. People started talking about it online, sharing the story, and suddenly Karen and her HOA were on the defensive. The whole town knew what they had done, and the pressure was building. They were no longer the hidden puppeteers pulling the strings behind the scenes. Now, they were the ones being scrutinized. And let me tell you, Karen hated that. She tried to downplay the whole thing at first. She issued a statement trying to spin it like I was some disgruntled homeowner with an axe to grind. But the more she spoke, the more people saw through her. It was clear as day. She had been lying, manipulating, and using her position of power for years to get what she wanted. And now that the truth was out there, people weren't buying her excuses anymore. At a meeting a few days later, the HOA tried to hold their ground. But when Karen walked in, the room was silent. No one looked at her the same way anymore. People weren't just questioning her tactics, they were questioning her integrity. The entire dynamic had shifted. I could see it in the eyes of the board members. They were scared. Karen was losing control, and it was obvious. A week after the article came out, a small group of us, Rick, Janet, and a few other neighbors, met up at a local coffee shop. The vibe was different. It wasn't just a bunch of people complaining about Karen. It felt like something bigger was happening. We talked about what we could do next, how we could make sure this didn't happen again, how we could take back control of our community. People were passionate. They were ready to act. The idea of a recall started floating around. We'd gotten enough people on our side by this point to make a real change. A few of the other neighbors suggested taking things to the next level, getting rid of the whole board, not just Karen. And it wasn't just talk anymore, we were making a plan. The story's exposure forced Karen into a corner. She wasn't the confident, condescending person who had stormed onto my property months ago. Now she was defensive, throwing out accusations and excuses. But it was too late. The community had already spoken. People were done with her, and they were done with the way the HOA operated. I'll never forget the look on her face when the petition to recall her and the board went around. At first, she acted like it didn't matter, like she could just sweep it under the rug. But deep down, I could see the panic in her eyes. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. It wasn't just the board that was at risk. It was everything she'd built. The power she'd held for so long was slipping away. That was when it hit me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It wasn't even just about getting back at Karen. It was about creating a community that didn't let itself get pushed around. It was about standing up for each other and making sure that no one had the power to make our lives miserable because they thought they could get away with it. The day the recall vote was scheduled, the atmosphere was electric. The entire community showed up, people who had never been to an HOA meeting before, people who had been too afraid to speak out. They were all there, and they all wanted the same thing, a change. We voted, and when the results came in, it wasn't even close. Karen and the board were out. Gone. Just like that. I remember walking out of that meeting, the sun shining down, and feeling this weight lift off my shoulders. It was over, not just for me, but for everyone. And it wasn't just a victory for me. It was a victory for the entire neighborhood, for everyone who had been too scared to fight back. And I think, in that moment, I realized something. Sometimes, when you stand up for yourself, you end up standing up for everyone around you, too. Karen and her HOA had fallen, but we had risen together. Looking back on it all, it's hard to believe how far I've come from that first phone call with the police at my door. Sometimes, it feels like that whole ordeal happened to someone else, like it was a different version of me, but then I catch myself and realize it was all real. I don't know if I can fully explain what it was like living through that mess. The constant pressure, the sense of being trapped, like I was caught in this web that kept tightening with every move I made. But when it was all over, there was this strange calm that settled in, not just for me, but for everyone. After the HOA was dismantled, it was almost like we were waking up from a bad dream. The community felt different, in a good way. People weren't whispering behind their windows or looking over their shoulders anymore. They started talking to each other again, not just about the weather or the kids, but about real stuff. People who had kept their heads down for years started stepping up, speaking at meetings, getting involved in decisions. And you could see that sense of pride in the neighborhood. We weren't just a group of houses anymore. We were a community, working together to make sure the same thing never happened again. For me, though, the calm came in waves. At first, I felt like I could finally breathe again. No more constantly checking my mail for the next ridiculous letter from Karen and her crew. No more feeling like I was living under a microscope, waiting for someone to come knocking with another fine. But there were quieter moments, too, when I thought about everything I had been through and wondered how I got here. Some nights I'd sit on my porch, just looking at the house I fought so hard to keep, and it would hit me how much I'd changed. Not just because I stood up for myself, but because I had to dig deep to realize what was really worth fighting for. It wasn't just about the trees or the shed, or even the fines. It was about my sense of home, my right to live without constantly looking over my shoulder. And somewhere along the way, it became about more than just me. It became about the people who had been too scared to stand up, too afraid to make their voices heard. That was the real victory. The community still talks about what happened, not in a way that feels like a scar, but as a reminder that things can change. We've kept a close eye on the new HOA board, making sure they don't slip into the same habits as the last one. It's funny, but now when I look at those empty spaces where Karen and her team used to sit in their meetings, it doesn't feel like a victory anymore. It just feels right. Like things are finally back where they should be. As for Karen, well, she's gone. I don't know what happened to her after the recall, and honestly, I don't care. Maybe she moved to another neighborhood, maybe she's still trying to control things somewhere else, but that's no longer my problem. I took back control of my life, and that's something I'll carry with me forever. There's a sense of peace that comes with knowing you stood up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. These days, when I walk down the street or talk to my neighbors, it's a different kind of conversation. We don't talk about HOA anymore, and we don't talk about the past. We talk about what we're doing now, the garden projects, the local coffee shop opening up around the corner, the kids' soccer games. Life has moved on, but every so often, someone will mention the fight, and I'll remember how we all came together, how we refused to be pushed around anymore. And then, just like that, I'll smile and realize something important. You don't have to win every battle to come out on top. Sometimes it's about finding the courage to keep going, no matter how big the fight gets. And when you've got the people you care about behind you, you're never really alone. That's the kind of peace I found. Quiet, earned, and completely worth it.